Okay, here we are for week 4 now, I guess. All right. Um, Question and answers. Before I kind of get going with that, just first things first. I've already posted the link to or the description of your project, your first project, which is due the 26th of February. That's 2 weeks. Um, if you have questions about that, sooner is better than later. Let me know. If you want to talk through things. Office hours next week are probably best, but if those don't work for you, let me know. We'll work something out. We got quite a few questions this week, actually. And I'll see. I don't know if there's a good place to start or not. Let's just start in on it. First one is kind of asking after who the people are that we're reading for this course, and like what other kind of POC authors might there be out there to kind of talk about. Because I'm kind of uncomfortably aware of the fact that the fantasy authors that I have assigned for this course are entirely white. That's probably mostly an issue with me, mostly an issue with the fact that I haven't done enough kind of work on that front, I think, to kind of find other people, which is partially my excuse would be the fact that I haven't done reading for pleasure in about 7 years. Um, just because of what I have to do for kind of, if I'm reading, it's for work. However, the one I do know, which I haven't assigned, and I kind of want to read more of her work, is Octavia Butler. If you haven't read anything by her, she's excellent, or she was excellent, sadly. Career cut way shorter than it should have been. And she tends more towards science fiction than fantasy, but for a lot of reasons, I feel like science fiction and fantasy go hand in hand, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. I would also kind of say, kind of on the more academic side of things, that there's a lot of people, particularly kind of on Twitter, and I don't know how much how much Twitter is a thing among the youths these days. But on Twitter, there's Mary Rambaran Ohm, Eric Wade, David Perry, Dorothy Kim, and Lee Green are people I would recommend kind of just looking at. They're all academics or former academics who kind of specialize in either critical race theory or kind of public outreach for medievalism, for medieval studies. And they're all super nice and friendly if you try to talk to them, and things like that. The authors we're reading for this week, Cord Whitaker is I wouldn't say a friend. He's a mentor. He's someone who's helped me out a lot with my work. He's a professor at Wellesley, relatively young. Works on Middle English, which is to say not Shakespeare and not Beowulf, but Chaucer. So when in April with the shower sutra, you can kind of get it's a language that's intelligible to modern English speakers, but it's very strange. Shakespeare is technically modern English, in case that's something people didn't know. As he said, he's at Wellesley. He works primarily in Middle English, working on things like the well, kind of race studies and things like that, but specifically at things like the Tale of the King of Tars, which is a Middle English tale, which the King of Tars, who is a black Muslim, is baptized and becomes white in the process of baptism. There's a lot of these sorts of stories. So he's the one who came up with the term like the shimmering mirage of medieval race, which I like quite a bit. As I said, he's really interesting. He came to talk here about 2 years ago. If he's nearby again, I will make sure to let people know. Ursula K. Le Guin. I've already kind of staked my flag on this one as her being more or less my favorite author of the 20th century. She was kind of born in 1929, died 3 years ago in 2018. she has this kind of she has a like a biographic piece that's like 2 pages long. I will kind of post it onto Canvas as an accessory reading. It's called Introducing Myself. It's clever. It kind of just encapsulates her as a human quite well. Le Guin is interesting for a lot of reasons. She comes from a very kind of intellectually privileged family. Her father was an academic. He was a very famous, actually, anthropologist by the name of Alfred Kroeber. North American anthropologist. He was one. He studied Native Americans in California. He was a professor at the University of Berkeley, UC Berkeley. Her mother, Theodore, was a successful author and a psychologist. Her brothers, both of her brothers, got PhDs and were professors, I believe. Maybe she had 3 brothers. She herself went into a PhD program, which she dropped out of in 1953 when she got married. Her husband has a PhD. She had a Fulbright for France in French literature. So not like a very kind of academically distinguished family. She kind of at the same time is very deeply kind of obsessed with, influenced by Taoism and Buddhism, both in her works and her personal life, and many of the characters, particularly kind of the world, the philosophies of the wizards in the Wizard of Earthsea is very kind of Taoist. I don't know much about Taoism though, so I won't kind of try to explain that more. The Wizard of Earthsea, her 2 kind of major, like the 2 books that had her biggest impact are The Wizard of Earthsea, which she wrote in 1968, and The Left Hand of Darkness in 1969. Wizard of Earthsea, as you've already read, is more fantasy. Left Hand of Darkness is distinctly science fiction. These 2 genres are kind of an artificial separation between them, I think. They're mostly doing the same thing, is that they're imagining something, and just the question is it in the past or in the future? In both of these cases, she's kind of obsessed with islands. As you've seen, Wizard of Earthsea occurs in an archipelago. The world is separated by water. Left Hand of Darkness occurs similarly in an archipelago of planets. The idea that like humanity spread across the stars, lost the ability to travel across the stars, 40,000 years passed, and now people are trying to kind of interconnect these islands, these planet islands again. This period from like 1968 to 1975 is kind of her most productive, perhaps, period. Omelas, Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, was written in 1973, for example. Unfortunately, she doesn't get quite a lot of recognition. She's won, Hugos and all those kind of science fiction, fantasy awards. She doesn't get that much note outside of that kind of a genre because science fiction, fantasy is very much siloed off from real literature in a lot of ways. And that's a problem, and that's kind of, we can talk about or we should probably think through why fantasy has this great influence over the way we think about things, right? We've talked a lot about the way the medieval kind of influences, but is not considered good culture, or is not considered haute couture, right? High culture. She has a profound legacy on the writing of, kind of like Tolkien, has a profound legacy on the way people write fantasy and think about fantasy. Like the idea of a wizard school, Harry Potter, is hers. Right, that's where Rowling got that from. Even things like the word Ansible, which means like a communication device that's capable of traversing galaxies, is her word, or a word that she rediscovered. And people like Orson Scott Card and Philip Pullman, I believe, have both kind of used it as a tribute to her. Orson Scott Card deliberately as a tribute to her. Next week's author. Do I want to say anything else more about Le Guin? No, I think I would encourage you guys to think about the ways in which Le Guin, coming from an anthropological background, perhaps, versus Tolkien coming from a linguistic background, kind of influenced the ways that they were going with things. Although as you've already seen, like naming things and words is very important to Le Guin. So that's kind of the thoughts I wanted to leave there. Tamora Pierce is much more of a pop or a pulp author. I wouldn't ever claim that her works are like high literature. She's just very much in the kind of the vein of just making novels that people like to read, young adult novels, really. And she's in the genre kind of very early. She's born in 1954, so like right after Le Guin dropped out of her PhD. And Alanna is kind of, this book you've read is published in 1983. Tamora Pierce was essentially one of the early fan fiction kind of turned popular author. There's not that much difference between like this and say Twilight, in terms of like, but the reference material for this, or was it 50 Shades of Grey? I can't remember. Whatever the link there was. The reference material for Pierce's work was kind of the traditional Ivanhoe, Arthurian legends, Tolkien that she read kind of growing up. And she was like, well, why are there no women in this? Let's do it. Most of her work, she has 2 different series, most of which occur in kind of this Alanna's universe, of which this is the first book. Most of them are either, relating to this character or her ancestors or future progeny. So yeah, those are kind of the authors and where they're coming from. And it's kind of interesting. So I want to use them to think through, as I'll talk about in next lecture, what people are, or ways in which we're going to think through, like, what's the utility of knowing all the stuff that we've talked about, right? What is the purpose? What can we do with it, right? So what? As if you have the misfortune of entering a graduate program, and at this point in time, I can't really encourage anyone to do that, and you present a paper on something that you've written to a professor, odds are they will sit down and ask you a question. They will kind of listen to it. They'll ask you some stuff, and at the end they'll be like, okay, so what? Right? Why is this argument that you have made? Why is this thing that you're saying about, I don't know, prose rhythms and Beowulf? Why should anyone care if they're a good professor? And if you're a good scholar, if you're a good graduate student, you should have an answer to that question. And that's true as much for like that kind of a paper as it is for a course like this. So I kind of want to try to answer that question a little bit. And I think that these authors, Le Guin and Pierce, but also, some of the stuff we're going to read later in the semester on kind of some of the more specific subjects, are a way of answering those questions. Other questions we have. Are there textual clues that are assuredly race in our sources? Yes. Yes, definitely. There is kind of something I glossed over, which I should kind of re-emphasize, is that there's been a pretty convincing argument to my mind that there is a distinct anti-blackness in late antiquity, right? Where late antiquity, remember, is the period kind of around the fall of the Western Empire, that is to say, 2 centuries in either direction of the year 400 or so, 450. And so there's actually been a recent article about that very verse, the Song of Songs. In the Song of Songs, I am black but beautiful, by Eric Wade, whose name I mentioned before, in 7th, 8th century Bede, the guy named Venerable Bede, who he will come up in next week's lecture. I actually haven't, Eric's article was just published maybe 2 weeks ago, so I haven't actually kind of had time to read and digest it. But like people are talking about it. So there is definitely this kind of anti-blackness in late antiquity, and there's definitely kind of anti-blackness in the 14th century, 13th century. What's unclear is the period in between. And I don't see it, but I don't have a comprehensive knowledge of every single text produced in that period. I don't think there's many people who do, but those who do don't really have have not asked that question. So if there are, I don't know of them. They might still be waiting to be found. I do want to emphasize the fact that like that kind of thesis, that kind of presentation that I was talking about, like we don't know about this. I want to emphasize the do not know, right? I offered a hypothesis and maybe a means of solving that, but I have no confidence in the ability of that sort of a thing to stand up once people actually really do scholarship on this subject. And that's kind of one of the things I didn't quite emphasize, but I want to re-emphasize on the same vein, is that racism as a general principle forces those who are racialized to defend their existence at kind of every turn. Like, why are you here, right? What gives you the right to be in this space? And that work is exhausting and time-consuming. And for a lot of academics of color, they spend most of their kind of professional efforts in trying to establish their right to exist in the space, whether that be through teaching, public outreach, or their scholarship, and therefore have very little time left over after doing that work to do something kind of just like to go play around with some sources, right? They can't afford to just do that. Because of the structures of racism in which they are forced to operate. And that's a problem. And part of the solution to the problem is like me going off and trying to do that, right? Because I don't have to do that extra work. Part of the solution to that problem is me trying to help them, me and people like me trying to be allies in that space. And that's a process rather than an answer. Other questions here. Someone asked about Bardcore. Bardcore. This is kind of great. If you haven't encountered Bardcore, go take a Google. It's medieval style, medieval instruments used to cover. Like rock songs, things like that. The first thing I know about is a guy named Algal the Bard, whose actual name is Alvaro Galan, who in 2007 covered System of a Down's Toxicity on medieval instrumentation. He himself, he's definitely coming out of like this Ren Fair thing. People have been covering kind of this sort of music at Ren Fairs forever. Renaissance fairs forever in both the US and Europe. They kind of didn't make a splash. And the real kind of splash came, I think, actually this past the April of 2020, kind of in the height of pandemic boredom. It was Hildegard von Bingen or something like that, who's playing off the name Hildegard von Bingen, who's a 12th century nun, did a cover of Pumped Up Kicks. So I didn't know a lot about this. I've done a little bit of research in the past 2 days onto this question. One of the bits of research involved listening to this kind of cover of Pumped Up Kicks, and she goes further than simply instrumentalizing the music. She actually kind of changes the lyrics to something that is old-timey. This is something, if you go and kind of find the video, this is something I would refer to as like Renaissance Fair Middle English, which is to say, it's in no way a language that anyone spoke, but it's a way people think now that like old-timey people spoke, with lots of ye old, with extra e's on things, and lots of these and thous and minds, which are with kind of a lack of awareness of the fact that these are kind of formal and informal distinctions in speech. English used to have kind of, if you studied French or any Romance language, there's a difference between tu and vous, right? Vous is formal. You talk to your teacher, you say vous. You talk to your friend, you say tu, right? English used to have the same thing. You is the formal. Thee or thou is the informal. That's actually what you say to your friends. And the reason why people think they're the formal is because you also address God in the informal. So the Bible has thee and thou when a person's talking to God, and people went, oh, that's fancy. So they kind of, when it fell out of favor in kind of common English, it people kind of looked at the Bible and went, oh, that must be fancy. So they started saying thee and thou like it was fancy. And then you have this kind of weird bastardization of a language that's kind of this Renaissance English, which is kind of what she's using in that piece. Which is kind of an interesting kind of bit of medievalism going on there. It's not that her language is wrong, it's that the language is coming from a particular place, and that particular place is identifiable because of the fact that it's not something that anyone ever spoke. Other questions. What's the difference between defining whiteness versus defining non-white groups? Because race does define, like there are, Asians are a subset of non-whiteness, or South American perhaps. So Hispanic is questionably an ethnicity or a race. Depends on a lot of things. Again, it depends on where you draw the line between those two things, or if you think there should be a line drawn between those two things at all. So I would say that the primary thing that race does is define who is white and who is not, right? That's kind of the most important distinction in kind of the modern way we think about race. There is still discussions, and this is, I think, a legacy of older kind of talking about, remember I was talking about things like octroon, which is kind of like a 1/8 black distinction that kind of comes up in the 18th century. There is an interest in kind of categorizing how not white people are. That's true, right? And that interest comes both from kind of white people themselves, the group, the in-group trying to exclude others, but also from racial groups that are racialized. A good example of this is in the U.S., Asian Americans who have tried to place themselves, like this idea of a model minority is a way of constructing a subgroup within a non-white group that nevertheless tries to associate and affiliate itself with whiteness. To the point that there is, profound anti-blackness within the Asian community, both in Asia and the United States. So and this is part of it. There was this argument made. It's a book called The Many-Headed Hydra, which is an argument that race is capitalism's answer to class solidarity. And I think that argument is nonsense, but I like it's like in actual historical reality, it doesn't make any sense. But kind of as currently implemented, it does, right? If you can keep poor people fighting among themselves because their skin color is different, then they're less likely to, seize the means of production or what have you. And one of the ways to do that is to have a kind of structurally is to say that this minority is more white than others, right? To say that to kind of give them the hope of whiteness forces a break between communities over that subject. And on the other hand, there are definitely groups that were once racialized others who are now members of the white subgroup, right? Italians and the Irish, for example. And I think, like as I said before, they're generally those groups are generally the ones we refer to as ethnicities. Ethnicity means like a race that we don't think is that different, in a way. And whether or not you agree with that would be an interesting discussion. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. Finally, the final question here is on the kind of misuse of Germanic and Celtic by historians, and what do I mean by that? Yeah, Germanic, Celtic, Slavic are the kind of three great categories of European culture, all of which make no sense. And they make no sense because they are not cultural groups originally. The terms Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic refer to language families, right? They refer to languages branch and tree, right? They if you look at you can map out languages like you would map out branches of a tree, starting with Proto-Indo-European for Western languages, kind of at the base, and then going out into things like Greek, Italian, Germanic languages, Slavic languages, Celtic languages. And, Germanic languages break off into English and Dutch and German, etc. Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, all closely related, for example. There are two non-Proto-Indo-European languages, as far as I can remember, in kind of Western Europe. They are Finnish and Basque. Those are languages that have no relationship to basically any of the other languages around them. But this kind of process is pretty straightforward, right? I don't know if anyone's kind of studied in this class, has kind of studied language in this sort of way, but eventually if you have people move around, they start saying things slightly differently, and those kinds of regional dialects eventually, with enough isolation and enough people not kind of talking to each other, become their own languages. That happens slowly over time, and it's a process you can backtrack very easily. This is basically the discipline of linguistics. So, as I said, Germanic, Celtic, Slavic are language groups. They are language families. And in the 19th century, kind of in this period we've been talking about a lot, those language families were also assumed to be cultural families. That is to say, if we are speaking the same language, we are one and the same culture. And this was very important at that moment because, again, this is a nationalist goal, right? If you remember, France before kind of the French Revolution, before about 1790, was almost no one in France could understand each other. None of them spoke Parisian French, except for small groups of people in Paris. There's Languedoc, there's Occitan, there is Breton, each individual region has its own language, and some little kind of words, like the word for like grocery bag is very different depending on where you go in France. But part of the process of nationalism is to standardize language, standardize culture, right? Those things go together and are assumed to be together, and then are retrojected back onto the past. So if current Germans all speak German and have, therefore, are Germany, right? Therefore, past people who spoke Germanic languages all also had a shared culture, which kind of, in the same way as the language evolved into what is now German, kind of passed down through the ages into what is now German culture, right? Same with Celtic, same with Slavic. And this is just not true. Like, there's no, just because, I and, someone from Scotland both speak English does not mean we have the same culture, right? And this kind of compounded through a third medium, which I've not really talked about a lot, which is archaeology. So archaeology kind of starts when we have this thing, okay, culture and language groups are the same. So this is Germanic culture in a Germanic language group, right? And we go and we do some archaeology on that. We find some grave goods, right? We dig up some things that these people have buried with them, right? And those objects are therefore Germanic. And so wherever we find those objects, we can now assume that there was a Germanic culture and a Germanic language group, right? Which is kind of the equivalent of, like, in, because I'm almost certainly going to be buried in a hooded sweatshirt. It's a certain, it's digging up my body in 300 years, finding I had a hooded sweatshirt on, and therefore assuming that any other grave that you find with someone with a hooded sweatshirt on, it spoke the same language and had kind of the same cultural values, which is absurd. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And the same, like with Celtic, this is the most clear, right? If you've never seen something, just kind of Google image like a Celtic knot, right? This is kind of just an art form. It's kind of this complicated interwoven thing, which is generally associated with cultures in kind of Celtic-y area, places where there's a Celtic language group, English, kind of Anglo-Norman world, British Isles, basically. But any other place that one finds these knots are assumed to be Celtic and therefore to share language and culture with this every other place that has them. And this, of course, kind of, because history and archaeology talk to each other, they kind of build off each other. As the history goes, well, archaeology says it, and archaeology goes, well, history says it. Except for the fact that history says it because archaeology says it, and archaeology says it because history says it, right? And we have this whole circular thing. And this is only recently, maybe in the past 20 years, kind of really been challenged as kind of a problem. And even then, it's faced really kind of strong criticism. There's a German school called Kulturkörner, which means like kernel of culture, which is like, yes, okay, it's wrong. We can't do this. But maybe there's like this nugget of shared something that they're all coming from, right? Culture seed, Kulturkörner. Versus kind of this, kind of particularly kind of in the Slavic world, talking about Slavic things, we're going to just, no, this has no, stop doing it. But that kind of no, stop doing it thing is a small minority of historians and archaeologists, of whom I would count myself one, but alas, not most of them. Okay, that was a long one today. If you have kind of questions about the project, again, please email me or come to office hours next week. My office hours have been quite busy, so if you have to wait a little bit, I'm sorry, I'll get to you. Even if you're waiting when the 3 o'clock kind of rolls around, I will get to you. I will make that extra time. That doesn't mean come after 3 o'clock. That means if it's 3 o'clock, if you've been waiting since before 3 o'clock, we'll finish out the list of people. Other than that, we do have a movie coming up in a couple weeks. I believe we're going to watch Kingdom of Heaven, which is Orlando Bloom being... It's a great movie because they told Orlando Bloom, please just stand there and don't react to anything, and he's really good at that. So it's an excellent movie. I like it quite a lot. And we will be talking about that. Trying to set up a watch time is going to be interesting. I'm going to see how we can do this. I think I'm going to try to live stream it over Zoom, because anything else is kind of trying to DMCA me. So live stream it over Zoom, I think, in 2 parts, one during each class time of the week we're going to watch it, and then I'm going to do it again kind of later in the evening for anyone who can't make the regular class time. Other than that, I will see you guys tomorrow.